Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Hetmanchuk and it's my pleasure to see all of you in our Brain Hub, a platform for discussions of important topics which are of concern to all of the Ukrainian society and not only Ukrainian. So I want to thank everybody who joins us. I want to remind you today is day 516 of the full-scale invasion. It's 10 years of the war, and now we will be talking about a very important topic about our pathway to NATO membership, about Ukraine as a security guarantor of Europe. So I want to introduce our speakers today. Joining us are Hanna, Hopko, chair of the board of ANTS NGO, Alyona Hetmanchuk, director of the New Europe Center. Also joining us is Mykhailo Gonchar, president of the Center for Global Studies Strategy 21. About to join us is Hennadiy Maksak, executive director at the Foreign Policy Council of Ukrainian Prism. And also joining us is Darya Kalenduk, Center for Countering Corruption, and we expect Roman Son to join us online, an international law expert. So good afternoon all. Ms. Hanna, let's start this discussion with you. We've just through the summit in Vilnius, so let's talk about its results. What is your evaluation of its results? Where are we moving to? Thank you very much for this opportunity. In fact, to plan our further steps during this discussion, obviously we, with our International Center of Ukrainian Victory, part of which ANTS network is, together with our strategic partners. So obviously before the NATO summit in Vilnius, we were trying to do the impossible. We were trying to get the political invitation, understanding the chances, but still we were raising the stakes so high that shouldn't we get the political invitation, the attacks, we should get them 100%. But unfortunately, after the 2008 summit, the failed summit in Bucharest in 2008, which gave the green light for Putin for his invasion in Ukraine and then for his invasion in in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine 2014. Alliance has not become something that can send signals to Russia that Ukraine is not considered as a buffer zone, but rather they see us as a part of the alliance. Why it's important for us to get this political invitation, and we've taken a lot of effort, specifically the experts present here, together with Olenka Halushko. We've developed infographics where we explained why the political invitation during the Vilnius summit does not mean the membership of Ukraine in NATO tomorrow during the Washington summit. So we were trying to debunk all the manipulative statements around that. We were trying to find the convincing arguments why Ukraine is in NATO is a valuable part for the alliance, why Ukraine can make NATO a global player in view of the threats to the democracies all over the world, specifically in region Asia Pacific. We've seen the representatives of Japan, South Korea during this year's summit, and we wanted to organize a geopolitical value of Ukrainian victory. So there is a conflict of realities. If in Ukraine we are under massive strikes, specifically what's going on now in Odessa, on a daily basis. So we've seen the political invitation of Ukraine to NATO as a signal to Russian Federation, and one of the pieces of puzzle in the mosaic of victory, just extension of F-16 fighters, and there was a lot of discussions with during the summit of NATO with the ministries, specifically with the Minister of Defense of the Netherlands, how to expedite the training of our pilots for F-16. So they didn't share this fondness of ours, and then they have to stress the supply of weapons to Ukraine, which is represented by Ramstein coalition, and further the prospects of membership, and you've seen the final text of communique, which clearly was saying that NATO will be ready as soon as Ukraine complies with the criteria. So for us, we see that we're on the track of a lengthy war, and we understand that for Ukraine it's one of the most complicated options, which increases the risks of failure, of loss. My priority task now in my work with the United States, with the Congress, with Washington, regarding the budget for year 2024, and it's important to have the budget as a signal for us not to be put at the table of negotiations, but rather that our partners will be with us as long as it takes. But our task is to expedite the reestablishment of territorial integrity, and regardless of those elements of blackmailing by Russia, and our task is to explain that we shouldn't be focused so much on the counter-offensive, because again it's a failing strategy, but rather the West should approve the political decision about the failure of Russian Federation in Ukraine, and to ensure all the complex of measures, including supply of more powerful weapons, including the sanctions which contemplate confiscation of Russian assets, which is another important area. So we've seen what were the discussions about the importance of Ukraine to preserve the support of the Western partners. This is why the empathy of Western societies is important, to have the political decisions to continue the support of Ukraine taken. So within the last 16 months after the beginning of the full-scale invasion by Russia, in fact the genocide, we understand how important is the issue of preservation of this support. It would be good if the President of Ukraine, together with everybody responsible for the foreign policy, eventually play as a national team, that they sit together and plan the priority steps, the campaign from Vilnius to Washington, to make sure that it's not again a company of indifferent communities dealing with European integration, because the further it goes, the more complicated it becomes. It will be important to coordinate all the efforts. We want the Office of the President, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, everybody responsible for the foreign policy, for the membership of Ukraine in NATO and EU. We want all of them in coordination with the representatives of the civil society who work efficiently in international arena that we play. There will be a lot of challenges, and our goal, the invitation to the summit in Washington, is of no doubt to anybody, bipartisan support and support by the countries that in this summit were not in favor of Ukraine, that this support grows and we start planning some campaign. But obviously more important here is to have more synchronized and coordinated work. Thank you very much, Ms. Alyona. I'm curious about your opinion in this regard. To what extent do you support your colleague? As Hanna mentioned, we are strategic partners, specifically talking about European and Euro-Atlantic integration, which we hope shortly will become the full-scale processes of Ukraine joining both of those communities. So yes, I support. I personally think that even understanding how ambitious is the goal we set for us in Vilnius, for political invitation, I want to stress is specifically the political invitation, not a formal official invitation. We were a little bit behind, a little bit too late when we set the priorities. A little bit too late was the synchronization of those priorities. We've understood our goal with some lag, we were not using the word invitation publicly until the very last moment. In the NATO members, not everybody was understanding what do we want from them in Vilnius, and we were told about that quite straight. We had a lot of advocacy visits to the key countries of NATO, and if back in March they were really looking at us as insane when we were talking about political invitation in Vilnius, within the last couple of weeks before the summit, this was already a matter subject to discussion. Our arguments were heard, because in March no one was even hearing them. There is no such an issue on the agenda as invitation, even political invitation of Ukraine to NATO. So I have to recognize we got a lot of allies, specifically among the leaders of thoughts in the countries, in the European countries, no matter how surprising it may sound, even in France. So really, what we were missing was the clear articulation of our goal in Vilnius, and it's important, as Hanna has mentioned, to set up priorities for the Washington summit, to understand what we would want to achieve there. We need to synchronize the position of the government, of the civil society and expert crowds, everybody who supports us in the countries of NATO. And I think that after Vilnius, our support has only grown, because there's a feeling, you know. Why are we sorry about Ukraine? They think that Ukraine really deserves better declaration, more intense declaration, and that's the feeling of offense about those decisions taken in Vilnius. It already drives, I see it in the communications that I have with diplomats and the experts from the NATO members, to work, to aspire to better results, to the result that would be satisfactory for us to the maximum extent in Washington. So let's be fair, NATO has not considered the summit in Vilnius as a historic summit for Ukraine. They were seeing it as the historic summit for Sweden, yes, because all of the efforts were aimed at unblocking the admission of Sweden to the alliance. For Ukraine, they were seeing it as another summit of solidarity, of support, just like the one that was held in Madrid last year, and they wanted to support that line until the very end. We broke it a little bit because we didn't want to let go of those historic opportunities emerging in front of us, and we realized that shouldn't we start this campaign now? It would be way more difficult to initiate it during the summit in Washington. So in our heads we were realizing that Vilnius is the first step and Washington is about to become the next step. So we were realizing it. Yes, what's of concern to me now, let me say it, let me express it, I think it's important, is the juxtaposition of notions that was occurring in the context of Vilnius summit, and the juxtaposition of notions is about the invitation and membership or admission of Ukraine to the alliance. Because if we check out the rhetorics that we were hearing in Vilnius during the summit days, from the leaders of alliance and from the advisor of President Biden, Jake Sullivan, whom Dalia Kaleniuk had an opportunity to ask questions during the public forum Ukraine-NATO. So they didn't mention the word invitation at all. They were only talking about membership. But there was a Ukrainian part in Vilnius. I don't know whether it was done consciously or unconsciously. We still don't have clear answer to that question, because many were manipulating it in Western media, when based on the political reasons the sign of equality was put between the admission and between invitation and membership, and somebody was putting this sign of equality due to their political unconscious, but I think that in the United States they unite those two processes. They want to see how they could be united as a one integral process without segregating those steps, that the invitation should be directly followed by the process of admission. We hope on that. We think that our position in Washington should be just like that, regardless of the situation in the battlefield, regardless of the situation at all. We should have the invitation, I don't know whether political or formal, and start of the admission process. So it should be our position. And another thing about the juxtaposition of notions around the security guarantees and security obligations, the juxtaposition of notions around the security obligations and security guarantees that the member states are ready to extend to us. We still don't understand what are they specifically, because it should be followed by the bilateral agreements which set forth the details, because it's only the framework agreement which was written in Vilnius. But I urge everybody to take that communication carefully, so we don't end up in the same trap where we end up after the summit in Budapest, when we were thinking we have some security guarantees, but they turned out to be some political assurances, and we can only be provided some consultations, that there is a consultation mechanism envisaged for us. So let's call the things what they are. I understand that from the political point of view, sometimes it's better to present it as the security guarantees and to start the discussions like there are no security guarantees existing in the world, and thus equalizing the membership in NATO at Article 5 to those security obligations which contemplate extension of weapons, financial support, to this Article 5, to the membership in NATO, thus blurring the focus. So it's a very dangerous rhetoric. We have to clearly put dots on top of I know already. I want to get back to the topic of security guarantees, but first I would like to give the floor to Mr. Mykhailo to hear his opinion about the results of Vilnius summit. We were very ambitiously aspiring to our goal, but there are parts of the society whose expectations were higher to the results of this summit. So what's your opinion? To what extent the results of the summit should satisfy us or not? Good afternoon. Since our strategic partners have already painted the picture, I would focus on something else. What Alyona mentioned, that this summit was symbolic for Sweden in many aspects. During the Crimea Platform Conference last week, there was an online meeting, and there was one of the alliance officials present. And he said it was a summit for Baltic Sea. Now we understand that Baltic Sea is the NATO sea. It has become a European Union sea, and somewhere in the end there is a piece of Russia there. So the Black Sea is mentioned twice in the summary communique in Article 79 out of the 90 articles of the declaration. So it says about the priority, quote unquote, for the Black Sea region for NATO, about the war in Europe, which is called war in Ukraine. And in this context, obviously the alliance looks like a kind of a group of countries near the Black Sea. However, 3 countries, Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania, they are part of the alliance, unlike Baltic countries. For example, why does it happen so? And I would like to proceed to this topic that I was about to cover. I was supposed to cover. It's related to what has happened, and it's about what was discussed before the summit and during the summit, but not in the platform of the summit, and after the summit as well, that NATO continues to be such an intimidated alliance. You know, in March last year, during the virtual security forum in Bled, Slovenia, I first used these words, and moderator was asking whether Mr. Gonchar is right, having called NATO the alliance of the intimidated. I haven't heard anybody dispute it, but what's the phenomena of this fright, of this intimidation? We may use more diplomatic terms, but since I'm no diplomat, I will use those terms specifically. So it's no secret for anybody that the fundamental reason is that the alliance and the United States as a leading country of the alliance try to avoid the nuclear confrontation by all means possible. But nuclear confrontation is the reality. Not the United States, not the members of the other members of the nuclear club are the initiators of this confrontation. We may see it in retrospective that it was orientation of the Putin's regime, the orientation to the nuclear confrontation, nuclear escalation. Now it occurs in the form of the nuclear blackmailing. It's not nuclear terror yet, but within this 17 months, today we mark 17 months from the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and layer by layer, this threshold, this is something that they try to cross. So retrospectively speaking, I'm getting back 5 months ago, in February this year, in Lviv, there was more formulated the manifest of the sustainable peace, prepared by a number of non-government organizations and experts, that was dedicated to the vision of Russia after the victory of Ukraine and failure of Russia respectively. And I want to focus on one specific article there. Let me quote that demilitarization and denuclearization of Russia are necessary from the point of view of punishment of the global community of the aggressor state that threatens use of nuclear weapons with the risk of emergence of the nuclear accident, and violated the agreement on non-proliferation of nuclear arms. So nuclear denuclearization of Russia is dictated by the case of attack of the nuclear state on the non-nuclear state who voluntarily refused the nuclear weapons, and United States as a leading nuclear country, as well as other members of the nuclear club, which are the countries responsible for the destiny of the world, should initiate the process of denuclearization of the aggressor country. There should be a condition set that the lifting of sanctions is impossible without denuclearization of Russia, and they will be intensified in case of refusal of Russia to denuclearize. I apologize for this lengthy wording, but I think it's very comprehensive. So I want to remind you that on the 24th of February last year, during his famous address before the beginning of invasion, Putin stated that they, meaning the West, they should know that the response of Russia would be immediate, and it would lead to the consequences that you were never witnessing in history. It was a tip-off to the use of the nuclear weapons, and on the third day Putin ordered to bring the strategic nuclear forces, the deterrent forces, bring them into this specific regime of combat duties. So this is the point of reference. We may recall the nuclear doctrine approved in 2020, which from the point of view of Kremlin gives them reasons for such a nuclear blackmailing. Obviously, when we're facing it now, why I've mentioned that the nuclear terror is something that may be pending, but nuclear blackmailing is something occurring now in a hybrid form. So having the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe under their control, they can use it as a lever of pressure, not only on Ukraine, but in the same way on the NATO member states and on the alliance in general. And this is exactly what Russia does. And in the art of the hybrid technologies, they've achieved very significant results. And I have to say that we may do some comparison. Recently, when there was an incident with an American UAV that was destroyed by a Russian fighter above the Black Sea, so the UAV has fallen. They didn't shoot it with a rocket, air-to-air rocket, but it was downed without any weapons. Our American friend said that it was a dangerous behavior by a Russian fighter jet. So it didn't result in nothing but a laughter in Kremlin, because it's a sophisticated art to down an aerial vehicle without use of weapons. So we have this situation when Russia uses the control over the nuclear power plant, and they bring us to the scenario of emergence of a nuclear incident with serious consequences. We may dispute the potential consequences, but facts are facts. And in this context, we stumble upon this issue that as long as this nuclear blackmailing exists, any progress as it's formulated by our Western partners in the solution of the Ukrainian war issues cannot be reached, because Russia uses the nuclear argument as the argument of deterring NATO in the east flank, where the war is going on within the 17 months, but in fact the last 10 years. So in this context we may say, how can we denuclearize Russia now? Obviously it's not a task that can be solved quickly, or there is a goodwill or something else, but that's the task that should be set on the international agenda, at least to ponder over it and to look for possible options. And in this case, when we talk about any other possible options, invitation of Ukraine to the membership in NATO, well, we didn't make it during the Vilnius summit, maybe we're gonna make it in Washington, but as long as this nuclear blackmailing factor exists and the alliance has this fright, it's difficult to count on any progress in this matter. But we should keep doing our thing. So this is where I will probably wrap up. Mr. Hennadiy, thank you for joining us. So talking about the nuclear blackmailing, what should we do to stop this Russian nuclear terrorism, and what about the security guarantees? What are they? What do we expect? Thank you very much for this opportunity, and before I start, I want to thank everybody who takes part in this panel, because I've seen the personal contribution in pushing the integration of Ukraine to NATO. Thank you for what you're doing. We're just in the beginning of our ways. So, answering to your question, the nuclear escalation is one of the narratives. This is something that other countries are afraid of those who have moderate attitude to Ukraine in the alliance. So we've studied this, we had expert interviews with a number of countries. We were asking what stops you, because what you declare is one thing, but what stops you is something else. It's a trigger, and for many the nuclear escalation is something that they may jump over. So that was their stopping point, that stopped their vision regarding what Ukraine is doing. As to the security guarantees, the first thing, I think we see the opportunities for different initiatives to get united, so that it's clear we were those who advocate the Ukrainian membership in NATO now, we want the invitation now, but the fact that certain synergies are looked for and that the G7 has given a framework, not guarantees but assurances that such guarantees will be, and they will be discussed in more detail shortly. It can say that there is a development of some mechanism of international law, and we may say that it's a moment when we are provided the opportunity to talk about what we can expect, and that they, as our partners, can provide to us. Obviously it will not be collective security, Article 5, but the fact that the countries are ready to provide certain guarantees, let's call it guarantees, it's a better term, guarantees of ensuring our financial stability, diplomatic and political support, supply of weapons. This is something that inspires our political establishment and our armed forces to continue the fight that we got involved in. So let me expand a little bit on that. There may be some options in terms of the procedures of the further movement. I've called it for myself a NATO autumn. Will rest in the summer, and we will have time to rethink it, how to work with it further on. So we were working with the representatives of the NATO headquarters recently. We've opened an office in Brussels, and we were trying to gauge the temperature there, what's going on. So our partners, they were saying that yes, the declaration that exists is something, so to say, their highest expectations for the January. When in January they started discussing what should be in declaration, they were saying that it should be the complex plan of actions plus. Nobody wanted to talk about the invitation back then. It was a huge work of our team, along with the colleagues in the panel, but it was not so obvious. The last round of negotiations has taken place in June, and no one knew when what would be the wording, and our colleagues said that they would not agree shouldn't there be the word invitation in that. So this moment even was not so well guaranteed in that format. We may say that there is a progress in what we're supposed to do next, and now everybody has exhaled, even Ukrainians, with relief and maybe a little bit of disappointment. Our partners have exhaled, but for the spring we have, for the autumn we have something to work on. We have a model to develop, but the procedures, the content, the agenda is something that we are supposed to help to formulate. They tell us the truth, that is the equal format of relations. It's not that as an alliance they dictate us something as the partner. So now we're recommended by our partners to do it the next way. So for the autumn, when we get back to this format, do the maximum you can to make sure that we can formulate what should be the procedure of the Council Ukraine-NATO. It's a big plus for us, something that we may move forward. Another area, the modified, modernized annual 5-year national program. It was a disappointment for us. We would like to get a more ambitious plan, the roadmap of our reforms, but on the other hand, it still has no substance. So we may provide our vision in autumn, and the civil organizations and the diplomats, they should say what are the ambitions of the plan, what should be the content of the plan. Our partners don't have understanding what should happen. There is a simple formula that needs to be filled, so we have time to regroup as an expert society and to come up with some specific propositions of what it should look like, rather than having that obsolete program between NATO and Ukraine. So I think it's again a very big plus that we should work on as the society. As I said, there will be a framework agreement of in bilateral format, but what we've mentioned, a political step, a classic diplomacy by our diplomats, it's a bilateral declaration for it. It says that it was a fortunate step, but we may amend something, to add something, to alter and modify the declaration. Ukrainian position, if I have a couple of minutes more, I want to propose some ideas that I deem necessary. So we should fill the agenda of the reforms, something that is not on the declaration in the communique of NATO. So those reforms that are mentioned there, this is the roadmap for us to show our success, to demonstrate our success. In our study, there are 3 groups of narratives that we should counter. First is the nuclear escalation by Russia, full-scale escalation and other formats of intimidation by Russia. Another area is non-readiness of NATO, and the third part is non-readiness of Ukraine. We should demonstrate that Ukraine is ready. We should show certain examples, and for our society, this is something that we should think about. We should divide thinkers and campaigners, because sometimes we resort to two elements as representatives of the centers who propose some ideas, and sometimes we shoot ourselves in the leg, because for the economic world, for the Westerners, the campaigners are not always equal to spread the ideas. So we have to think how to equalize think tanks with think tanks, campaigners with campaigners on the level of dialogue, so we don't create obstacles for one another, but rather we intensify our synergy. But it's important for think tanks, because in the West there are part of the decision makers in their countries, the people who advise what to do and how to do that, who provide certain proposals. It's important to talk about the NATO standards from the first person. It's a narrative that we were working with, like, look, the fact that NATO logistics helped us survive, that we proceeded, well, not to Lockfest, but we were working in compliance with their logistics standards, with our ammunition, it's good. But on the other hand, those examples are cool when we propose those people who were working with it, the commanders of units who were using this scheme, the commanders of certain intelligence or other agencies who said that we're working in compliance with these standards, and I can be a good example for you. And what's interesting, that it goes not only from the political level, but it's something requested by the headquarters of NATO. It's interesting to listen to the analytics, but somebody who says that the middle rank Ukrainian officers who got NATO education, well, it worked against the Russian standards about the Russian army. So the more opportunities we get, the better is to work with them. And obviously, what can be another Ukrainian innovation, well, maybe not innovation, but the intensification, the triangle Ukraine, EU, NATO. In the beginning of the year, we launched the platform Ukraine, EU, NATO, it had a logistic format, but again, not everybody is satisfied with the place that was taken by the cooperation between NATO and EU in the communique, but Ukraine is something that forms their agenda now, so we're trying to find those bridges between EU and NATO. Is something that helps us in our candidacy and in acquisition or opening of negotiations about joining European Union by the end of the year, and we demonstrate to our NATO partners that we can work, and we understand that architecture of our security is joint. We are part of this architecture. So I'm about to wrap up at this point. Ms. Daria, as your colleagues were saying, we as the media and the messengers, they were all rife with your question to Mr. Sullivan. So what is the homework we should have done upon the results of the summit? Well, the conclusion is basic. The war in Ukraine will end as soon as we become a part of NATO. This is when it ends forever, and we will not have our next generations inherited. So I asked Mr. Sullivan, I said my son is 11, was 11 when the full-scale invasion had started, and as he becomes 18, I want the war to be over by then, and we have to unite all the civil organizations, corruptionists, anti-corruptioners. The national idea should be admission of Ukraine to NATO, and we should all get united. We should unite all of our resources, campaigners, analytic, advocacy resources. So this is the first statement. Another statement is that haven't we been extended the invitation because Ukraine is corrupt? No, Ukraine was not invited to NATO because we have corruption in Ukraine. We were not invited because NATO, specifically the United States, are not ready to invite Ukraine to NATO. Why aren't they ready? Because they underestimate or overestimate Russia, or they underestimate Ukraine. There's a number of variants. They don't know, for example, what to do with Russia after they lose, who will inherit the nuclear weapons. That's another story with denuclearization. They're afraid that should Russia fail, they will split into a number of countries. They're afraid that China will grab part of their territories. Meanwhile, Russia is a European country, and they should be preserved in close to the European countries, and some of the crowds are afraid of nuclear escalation. So this nuclear blackmailing that Mr. Mykhailo mentioned, it works. It works in certain crowds. It doesn't work in Baltic countries. It doesn't work in Poland, not even in the Nordic countries. But in Germany, in the United States, it still works. However, when during our meetings with the foreign opinion leaders, when we ask how come the Kremlin elite may launch nuclear missiles to the NATO countries where their children, lovers live, other members of their families, what is their motivation to start the World War III? Russia is not USSR, right? As it was like 35 years ago, where all the government officials were living in Russia or in the Soviet Union, and they were closer to the bunkers. The children of Kremlin decision makers don't live in the bunkers. So we've made this research for NATO. We've represented it in more than 10 countries, the NATO members, mostly in the Western and Central Europe, when we were explaining what is Kremlin. There is a map of Kremlin and decision making, and the more our armed forces kick the butt of the Russian army in the battlefield, the more economically motivated elites in Kremlin have influence over Putin, the more Kremlin stands their ground, the more successful they target our elevators, ports and critical infrastructure elements, the more they kill our military, the more the Kremlin war party wins and Putin gets inspired with his results, with his success, and the more he is inspired to continue this escalation. So those are the political tools we're working with, and we should continue working with them. As Hennadiy said, we should continue debunking the myth around Russia. Many people in the West, specifically in America, they have this myth that Russia is a new Soviet Union, but it's a laughingstock with a GDP smaller than Italia's GDP, and their army is a laughingstock. Obviously, we shouldn't underestimate them, but they're definitely far from the second army of the world, and the only army in the world which repels the offensive of Russian army to deter which NATO was created is the army of Ukraine. And there's yet another question: is the fight with corruption in Ukraine something that will expedite our membership in NATO? And the answer is yes. Yes, because it helps us get rid of the very convenient public argument that was already used by President Biden, that we keep hearing in Germany and other NATO countries like you're a corrupt country. You see, we've allowed Hungary in, and you see what it looks like now. You have a lot of internal problems, and we understand that this argument is used very frequently to hide another argument that they are ashamed to mention, the fact that they're intimidated by Russia. So what we should have done by the summit in Washington is to overcome the corruption, specifically in defense sector. There are big anti-corruption tasks we should fulfill, like resume the electronic declarations so that the officials understand that the public watches their incomes. So we've seen this story with the Odessa conscription center director with the apartments in Spain registered in the name of his mother. So it's an embezzlement during the war that should be equalized with the high treason. And the Spanish that look at those things, they ask themselves, why should we continue supporting Ukrainian refugees? Why should we continue sending weapons? We don't want to have such country as a member of NATO, where the heads of the conscription centers have apartments in Spain. And this is the narrative that we should destroy, and we should destroy it getting back the tool that we used to have, the mandatory electronic declarations, tax declarations for the officials, for the government officials, except the military. Then we have to protect the anti-corruption bodies. There are attempts of intruding in their work, but still in the sector of defense and security. We need to recall that the defense budget in Ukraine is a half of our annual expenses, and defense budget of Ukraine is 100% made of our taxes. So every hryvnia of tax we're paying in Ukraine is forwarded to the defense budget. The rest of the expenses is subsidized by different other programs like IMF, direct financial support by EU and the United States. And we're obliged to control the way those funds are spent, and our government authorities should report in front of us about the efficiency of such spending. This is why the government procurements in the defense sector should be a priority number one, but not only in paper, not only in the statements by the Minister of Defense, but in reality, so that every soldier wears a good uniform, they have necessary number of civil drones that Ministry of Defense is capable of procuring. We haven't heard in Vilnius that anybody tells us that, you know, we don't accept you to NATO because you procure Chinese Mavic drones, or it may infringe the relations between the United States and China. So that's the justification that Ministry of Defense has made up, that procurement of Chinese drones will be of harm to our relations with the United States. But it's all about the inefficiency of the ministry and the lethal weapons, the procurement of weapons. It's a top secret procedure, regardless of the fact that 90% of all the weapons that we get from the partners is a public information. We know how many HIMARS we've got, and when the Pickham Strikers, Bradley, all that information, 90% of that information is made public, and it does not produce any harm to our defense capabilities, but 100% of the information, what weapons we buy from whom, is assigned at top secrecy, and we don't understand where this money goes, for which weapons specifically. But we have to learn to procure weapons directly from the NATO manufacturers. We have to make a clear and transparent procedure for different mediators, how to get a contract with the Ministry of Defense. So this is what's called the NATO standard procurement, and the agencies created with the Ministry of Defense, they don't function properly. The agency for procurement of weapons, management of which was appointed in some unclear way, they seem to be procuring something, but we see overdue debt when the money left the country, but the weapons are still not here. About the lethal weapons procurement, the Minister of Defense promised to launch this agency half a year ago, but there is no agency, there is no management, and there is only a department with the Ministry of Defense. There is no management and only the acting head of the department. So it all looks like an attempt to cover a big problem with a fig leaf, and we will continue pressing on our government, specifically on the Ministry of Defense, to fix this thing. We have to have it fixed before the next summit in Washington. There is a number of problems we have to solve, like implementation of lockfast for some standard weapons of NATO. It was an important step which calmed a lot of critics in the States who said that the weapons that get supplied to us goes in some wrong way. So we have to switch from the paper army to a digital army that will improve the collection of information, what we need to buy, what weapons are missing, what is non-lethal support that's missing, how to distribute this lethal and non-lethal support between the battalions. This is something that is being documented on the paper, and we have to switch from the paper to the digital paperwork turnover. We have to protect it, but not with the law that is in effect on the state secret, which was set forth during Soviet era, and it is not in accord with the modern challenges. So we have a lot of homework, and we hope that the result of work between Ukraine and NATO will be the representatives of Ukraine in the NATO headquarters, who will work with the professionals. Well, there are professionals, but there is a number of inefficient people there. So anyway, we should work with the Ministry of Defense, with the civil organizations, with the parliament, to identify what are the steps and to implement those interoperability steps. As representatives of civil organizations, we are ready to provide our vision of what's going on and what needs to be changed. And in the end, I want to say a couple of things. I'm sorry for taking this much time, but it's still important. During the summit in Vilnius, we've reminded that we rejected the nuclear arms, so we're not asking for help, we're asking for what's due to us. We are in genocide war against us, the war initiated by the nuclear state. There are such countries as Britain and Russia who seem to have guaranteed security for us, and there is no such security. This is why, as a country, we see two options. It's either NATO membership, or otherwise we don't have other way out than to develop our nuclear weapons. And when, just like Israel has done, and when we were told about the model of Israel that was proposed by the United States about their security guarantees, someone omits that Israel has nuclear weapons. Many prefer just to close their eyes to that fact. And another question that we asked during the advocacy meetings, including among Americans and Germans, we asked them, what should NATO do should the Ukrainian party lose? What's your final scenario in this war? Are we obliged to formulate the final scenario of the war between Ukraine and NATO, freezing of conflict as it was happening in Minsk during Minsk I and Minsk II, is unacceptable for us, and we should convince them that it's unacceptable for them as well. Thank you very much. I hope we're having the speaker online. Mr. Roman, are you with us? Thank you very much. Are you hearing us, Mr. Roman? I hope you've heard our previous discussion, so we would like to hear your opinion regarding what we should do by the next summit in Washington. Yes, I was listening to the discussion very attentively, and I want to say that I share the concerns of the panelists, specifically of Ms. Daria and Mr. Mykhailo. I share the position that the membership of Ukraine in NATO is the mandatory component of our victory, because Ukraine in NATO is the strategic failure of Russia, so we should take maximum efforts to achieve this goal. It's extremely complicated. The Vilnius summit emphasized the differences between Ukraine and the basic consensus within NATO, based on which they formulate the collective policy regarding Russia and Ukraine. Our interest is to protect Ukraine, inflicting failure upon Russia, but for NATO the main priority is not to get involved in the war and not to have Russia fail. It's their political line that is adhered both by Berlin and Washington, because the West does not accept Putin as a Hitler of the 21st century. The NATO is not ready to fight them as the Nazi Germany. They emphasize the support of the alliance to Ukraine. They hide behind NATO as a justification, something that relieves them of the responsibility to fight Russia. So instead of the decisive actions, they propose different resolute accusations. For us, it's the fact that Putin cannot achieve success, and they think that Ukrainian sovereignty is preserved, and the only thing left is how to regulate, settle the conflict, so it's not a threat to NATO itself. Starting from 2014, all the proposals of the West were boiling down to the concessions at the expense of Ukraine. So let's get rid of the illusions that something cardinally changed in the year 2022 in the Western agenda. There was ultimate requirement to Russia to cancel the changes in the constitution, which approved occupied territories of Ukraine as part of Russia, but Russia does not refute its territorial claims. It's been clearly understood in Washington, in Europe, but what we see is quite the opposite. The official line of the West is to support Ukraine in sitting at the negotiations table with a strong position. Nobody says what to negotiate, but we see that Russia accepts no concessions. And the West knows that Ukraine has no levers to change constitution of Russia, so we're talking either by the concessions about the concessions by Ukraine or the truce agreement as a result of exhaustion of all the parties. If Ukraine does not reestablish their territorial integrity, the West may not recognize Russia's claims, but then they may reload their relations with Russia, which is very cynical, but we've seen it a couple of times, but it's in compliance with their goals to deter what they call the World War III, that the Western politicians intimidate their citizens starting from 2014, not less than Russian propaganda. Unfortunately, West ends up in the intellectual dead end, and they will stay there as soon as the threat by Russia remains, and it will not change the situation even with the change of power in Kremlin. And they are not ready to undertake any obligations about the membership of Ukraine, as we were able to see in Vilnius. As Ms. Daria mentioned, we were asking for invitation, but to reason their refusal, it was required to have a manipulation campaign. It was coordinated, it was occurring in all media, and the opinion leaders were talking about this, and the subject of negotiations was juxtaposed with intimidation of the Western community, that joining Ukraine will have the alliance involved in the war immediately, something that we should have formalized in year 2014. We were offered to formalize the military cooperation, but no matter how long we call the Budapest assurances guarantees, they provided no real guarantees to us. In the same way, the agreements on the military cooperation will not guarantee our security or territorial integrity. No matter how long are the needles of the porcupine, it can become a victim of a bear. It's not a reality of the wildlife, but is the nature of the genocidal war. They don't even conceal it. They will destroy everything to the ground to rebuild it then. So Putin thinks that if people raise Hiroshima from ashes, there are no obstacles on his way of defeating the existing world order. So Mr. Mykhailo is exactly right about his concerns. The West considers the risk of nuclear war quite seriously. For them, it's a standard remark for Ukraine. They understand that Putin has his hands itching to reach the red point, but they didn't find anything better than selling us the concept of porcupine that they're trying to push for Taiwan for the last 20 years. And the fact that Ukrainian army now has enough weapons for successful counteroffensive without the aerial component, when we are being comforted with the assurances of political support, I say thank you, but you better give us the real support, something that the victims of aggression were receiving in the past, like Korea or Kuwait. None of them were part of NATO, but they were defended by international armed forces. I want to emphasize that international armed forces, there were United Nations level measures taken to have those forces get into fight. They had Western soldiers, they had Western weapons, something that we're not seeing in Ukraine. And I want to assure everybody present here that under circumstances where our partners lack leadership, we need unprecedented steps. We don't have to come with our hand extended. You get not what you want, but rather what is excessive with them. To get invitation to NATO, we need the real heroism in the diplomatic front to break the existing balance of interests, which really defends Russia against full humiliating failure, but we have to generate the initiatives that break the standard. If NATO is not ready to guarantee the security of Ukraine, regardless, the war should find the will to guarantee the security of the Western Europe against attack by Russia. Ukraine can thus formalize their moral leadership without asking permission from anybody. We may ensure our role as a defender of Europe. So, in cooperation with Rihanna Gitz, an English researcher, we published a material where we set forth the concept of the declaration of Ukrainian government. They should unilaterally proclaim that in case of illegal armed attack of by Russia of our partners, Ukraine will see it as an act of aggression against ourselves, and upon request we will provide support. It's not a G7 declaration, it's a unilateral obligation, just like the Article 5 of Washington Agreement. We conditionally call it the self-integration to NATO. Many people obviously are asking, do we really need to undertake those additional risks? But we set it forth in detail in our article. But listing the key articles, listing our key goals is number 1. Ukraine may convince the West that our membership is not only an attempt to hide under the umbrella at the expense of the West, at the expense of growth of the risks to the West, but the membership in NATO will mean that we will have obligation to defend our partners. If we want the NATO citizens to sacrifice something for the sake of Ukraine, we have to declare our readiness to do so as well. Second, Ukraine is a country with a unique experience of direct war with Russia. We will fill this niche in Europe. NATO has their vulnerabilities. They are being discussed little, but the capability of the alliance to defend the Western partners remains a challenge. We give more details in the article, but the conclusion is such that nuclear deterrence or conventional means in the east of NATO cannot fully guarantee the efficient defense against aggression. 1 year ago, Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, said that their country, in case of attack by Russia, may be eradicated. She was publicly criticizing the defense plan of NATO that admitted the many months of occupation of the captured territory by Russian occupiers. She said that the forces available in the region will be destroyed by the Russian aggression. So NATO intensified the eastern flank, but the problem has not disappeared, and the role of Ukraine would be very important in this regard. And third, Ukrainian guarantees will stimulate NATO to act more actively, regardless of all the countries and assurances of Washington. The Eastern European countries have something to concern about. If we can ignore the nuclear blackmailing, the genocide of Ukrainians, if we may have Kakhovka dam without response, so why wouldn't the alliance sacrifice the smaller countries to avoid the global nuclear holocaust? And fourth, Ukraine will put a period about this dispute regarding the gratitude. As tweet of Mr. Wallace said, there is a perception in the West that Ukraine is a recipient of support, and the more gratitude than to be ready to sacrifice the lives of our defenders, what should be expressed as a bigger gratitude. Well, and five, we may debunk the myth disseminated by such anti-Ukrainian countries which are allied with Russia, such as Hungary and Bulgaria, and we should consider all the eastern flank of NATO from Finland to Romania. It would be justified to include Moldova too, because the pro-Western course of Chisinau can only be preserved with NATO, and pro-Western orientation of Moldova is of security to us, and the last Ukrainian guarantees will provide the security for all the partners which guarantee the membership in the NATO. And starting from year 14, when the West was trying to preserve the face of Putin, we were trying to preserve the face of the West. We were doing everything in their interest, and now it's time for leadership, so that our interest eventually become the interest of the West. Today, the doors of NATO are closed with the closed with fright, and only our bravery may become something that opens that door. Thank you very much, Mr. Roman. I think that even after this event we will have all these statements in our head. I want to give an opportunity to our colleagues to ask questions, should they have any. Good afternoon, Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. I have a question to Ms. Hetmanchuk. In your opinion, to get the political invitation in Washington, would it be sufficient for Ukraine to comply with the necessary criteria, or we should continue working with the governments of United States and Germany, who are the main opponents of it? Or do you think it should be some separate case, or we should find some universal argument for them? Well, thank you for the question. First, about the criteria or the conditions, we still don't understand what are those conditions. We have to get more details. We have to come up with the proactive position to formulate it as we see it, because we are offered to work within the framework of the obsolete, irrelevant, and non-efficient tools such as annual national program. So we should come up, obviously, with the list of things that will be clearly formulated, just like 7 recommendations that were proposed by the European Union. And based on those 7 recommendations, we may develop a set of criteria to be agreed with NATO, because if it's not coordinated with them, obviously they will not be perceived as fulfilled obligations. But at the same time, we have to understand that they will not be in hurry themselves to formulate those criteria or conditions. So we should be proactive, and we should offer our vision. And an important moment, there will be a political decision by the European Union. I hope we will be able to see it in December. The initial negotiations with European Union, and if there will be such a political decision, it means that there is a progress in the areas of rule of law and democracy and freedom of speech, because those are the fundamentals that those 7 recommendations are based upon. So if EU gives this powerful signal that they open the way for negotiations, United States and other NATO countries will not be able to ignore. If you're a Germany and you give the green light, if you say yes, that Ukraine has a progress with reforms, and you as a part of NATO, you say no, there was no progress within this period. So there are nuances, and we think that this EU decision is very important. Regarding the work with the governments, it's important too. It doesn't always work with the same arguments. We've noticed it before the Vilnius, for example, arguments about the NATO membership as the security guarantees, and I want to emphasize is that we only consider the NATO membership as the security guarantee. The other things we see as the guarantees of security support. So in Italy or Germany, it's a guarantee of security for the investors for recovery of Ukraine. Is something that works there, but it's not very well heard in the United States, because they don't have such ambitions to undertake this role in recovery of Ukraine as Germany or Italy. And Italy was the first country to open the recovery office in Kiev, in Ukraine. So it's an example of the arguments that work. For example, in the United States, it's about the nuclear blackmailing that was not yet transformed into terrorism, but may well be transformed in such, because for any American president, specifically if they are a candidate, their nightmare is the beginning of the nuclear war during his cadence or his campaign for the next election. So yeah, that's the worst nightmare of theirs. So it's important for us, and these days we've started already consultations about the campaign for Washington. What is it should be filled with. We will discuss it with the partners next week, with our partners in Washington, because we understand that the Washington summit will be happening during the presidential elections in the United States upon the end of primaries, and we were explaining that it would be safer for Biden to approve this decision in Vilnius rather than in Washington, because we don't know, we don't understand what the narratives will be. However, we have some tips. We follow the statements by Trump and other representatives of this right wing of the Republican Party. So we have to understand what to do to make it more beneficial for Biden as a political candidate during the campaign. So the factor of presidential campaign in the United States will be an important factor. We should know what political forces to talk to. So this is the last thing I want to say about the United States, because I may talk about it hours and hours. So a part of the fright of escalation, there is another intense factor that didn't let the United States come up with the political decision of invitation of Ukraine in Vilnius. So it's about the Ukrainian membership with NATO to be the part of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. So we shouldn't talk about any alternative security models as Israel model. Well, usually Israel is mentioned because now in the United States we see falling in love with Israel model on the level of opinion leaders and decision makers, which made an obstacle for us to achieve our goal in Vilnius, and we were saying it directly to American diplomats. So we have to say that we see no alternative. There should be no concessions, neutralities, Israel models that I don't see fit for Ukraine. We're preparing with the New Europe Center a clear explanation why it wouldn't work for Ukraine. We only see it as an intermediate step on the way of admission of Ukraine to NATO, and we're not convinced that Israel model may even deter Russia, let alone defend Ukraine against any potential future aggression or invasions. So we have to communicate it all to the United States, where they are in love with this Israel model, which is an alternative in their opinion to Ukrainian membership in NATO. And in the same way, there is a discussion in Germany about the alternative models, alternative security models for Ukraine. If some perceive Ukraine as a potential NATO members, others try to make up some alternatives. So we have to get involved in the discussion. We have to say why only NATO membership is a real guarantee of security. if I may, just one important thing you said, the key countries, United States and Germany, but for Ukraine it's important to be creative here, and we should be based on our standard advocacy means. What Mr. Roman said, I appreciate this vision that Ukraine is a guarantor, the security guarantor. Our armed forces didn't let the enemy through. We defend the eastern flank of NATO, so our unilateral security guarantees for the alliance countries, why are they important? Because they may become the platform for coalition for those who talk to Berlin, not only Ukraine, but also the countries of Eastern Europe, Northern Europe. They have to explain, because it's not only Germany who were opposing as well as the United States. Our task today is not to have only Ukrainians argue why we should join NATO, but we should make it through the countries of Eastern and Northern Europe. Again, I want to emphasize that the president of Ukraine should have gathered not only his advisors, who, as Alyona mentioned, are too much behind the campaign before the summit in Vilnius. We've lost a lot of time and in the NATO headquarters, and our key partners were not understanding why or what Ukraine actually wants. We cannot afford losing any more time. We have to explain it with our hands and with our mouths, and with the readiness of our partners to come to Berlin with us in the same way that we were doing last May and last June during the extension of candidacy status, when our friend Andreas Kubilius and the Germans from Christian Democratic Party, they were convincing the socialists, the Czechs, Romanians, Polish, we have to form the coalition of countries which in fact will overweight that scale for those who hesitate or who impede Ukrainian advances to NATO, to have them eliminated with the public opinion. So it's not only Ukrainians, but also Finnish, Lithuanians, Norwegians, Scandinavians to come to Washington as well, and they should actualize this matter, that it's in the best interest of theirs to have Ukraine in NATO, because sometimes as we come to Washington, I cannot say that they're tired. They say, are you coming again? And we say, yes, we'll keep coming until we get Crimea back. So please be patient until the very moment of reestablishment of territorial integrity, until the next visit of Biden or the next president to the occupied Crimea in Ukraine. So I don't want to say that they got tired of us, but they keep asking, are you here again? But we're about to come in September again to talk about the budget. So we have to keep the doors of White House and Pentagon open for Ukrainians, because we won't be coming on our own. We want this conversation to never end, but we're quite limited on time. It's a little bit pessimistic, but this is probably the best thing we could do. So we're ready for those risks that may emerge. Just for a little bit of optimism, what Mr. Roman said, I was a little bit skeptical when I've seen this article in the Mirror of the Week. But then I've rethought it. You know, there is rear and avant-garde. The avant-garde in NATO is the United States, because the NATO is USA plus, but those who should be in the avant-garde are now in the rear. But the avant-garde has already formed. It's Polish and Baltic countries, those who have joined border with Russia, and now Putin is talking about the joint state of Russia and Belarus. So this is not only about the political signal, it's something more. We can hardly help Norway if Russia occupies Svalbard in direct or hybrid form, but to help our Baltic partners and Poland, yes, we are capable of that, and that should be perceived for real. Thank you very much for this profound and very really interesting conversation. We want to thank our armed forces, thanks to whom we can continue to hold events like this. So thank you very much. Let's continue working for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.